Do you ever catch yourself saying, English is just crazy? Maybe your students come across a tricky word and you tell them, you just have to memorize that one, or this is the part you have to know by heart. But deep down, you know it's still confusing. Here's the truth. English isn't random. It's a wonderfully complex system, and once you understand how that system works, through sound, structure, and meaning, everything changes. That's what Sarah, Paul, and I teach inside Mastering Morphology. This isn't another curriculum. It's deep teacher knowledge inside a practical, comprehensive course that finally shows you how words really work. No more exceptions, no more gimmicks or patching holes with memorization or phonics alone. It's time to go beyond sound it out and give your students the framework they need to truly understand words. So if you're ready to stop guessing and start teaching with confidence, join us inside Mastering Morphology. Enrollment is open now, so we invite you to click the link in the show notes to get started. You're listening to episode 60 of Literacy in Color. Today, we're diving into an important conversation about making reading research more accessible for educators. We have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Neena Saha, who began her career in education as an educator for children with exceptional needs before earning her degrees at Columbia and Vanderbilt. Her doctoral research on decoding resulted in patented technology, which she subsequently licensed to establish Elemento, developing tools to align phonics instruction with appropriate texts. Following acquisition by Metametrics, she created early literacy products, including Lexile Find a Decodable Book, while publishing her Reading Research Recap newsletter. Currently, Dr. Saha serves as an EdTech consultant while investigating methodologies for implementing research-based practices at scale. Through today's conversation, you'll see she's passionate about bridging the gap between research and classroom practice, and I can't wait for you to hear her insights. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. Today, we are very lucky and fortunate to be chatting with Neena Saha, and she is a brilliant mind in the reading research realm. And if you're not already familiar, she has a fabulous channel on YouTube where she posts videos called the Reading Research Recap, where she takes the latest research in literacy and breaks it down into digestible chunks to make everything more accessible for educators. So today we're going to be talking about reading research and how to make research more accessible to teachers. And Neena is very passionate about removing those barriers around research because we need to put research into the hands of those who need it the most, and that is the teachers who are implementing this important work. So first of all, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I love talking about this, so I appreciate it.
Of course. So would you briefly introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background in this whole literacy realm?
Yeah, and I'll try and stay brief. So I started as a teacher probably like 15 years ago now as a special education teacher. And that kind of set me up perfectly for the science of reading movement that was to come, like a few years ago, because special education is really focused on research and explicit teaching. A lot of these ideas that we know works well for every child, but especially for kids with like dyslexia and stuff, you need to be doing that. So it was kind of a great preview into what would come later, but I was a teacher for a while. I went back to school. I went to Columbia University and got my master's in educational neuroscience. love the neuroscience part about the brain, but just realized like it was a little bit too far from the classroom and like the practical application that I was used to. And so when I did my doctorate, I did it in a lab that had both neuroimaging stuff, but also behavioral, meaning like observing and measuring, quantifying how students learn to read words. So that was really my specialty, decoding and individual variation in how children learn to read. And there's this fascinating project during my doctorate program about how do we measure decoding. And so I was part of a team that came up with a new measure because there is nothing in that space. There's lots of different readability formulas and there's Lexiles, which are really great for market leaders for grades 3 through 8, but there's nothing that like really pinpoints how to measure text so that it's decoding applicable for them. And so I did that for a bit. And then after that, I started my own company called Elemento, and I licensed the technology we developed at Vanderbilt and tried to get that up and running. About a year and a half in, though, it was acquired by Metametrics, the creators of the Lexile framework for reading. So I joined them full time. And right now, though, I'm a literacy consultant. So I stepped back from full-time work for them. So I told you this wouldn't be brief, sorry. But I've kind of dabbled. The big takeaway is I've dabbled across different things. I think the key points being I've been in the classroom, I've been in as a researcher in academia and in corporate, so product development. And I think that kind of gives people unique insight into all the different facets.
That's so interesting. I am like mind blown by all of your experience with EdTech because that is so beyond my scope of any expertise. So I just think it's so interesting. And that's one thing that I really appreciate about the work that you do because you do mesh both worlds of research and implementation really nicely. And I think that's really helpful for a lot of educators. You mentioned this whole science of reading movement, and oftentimes, educators are told they need to follow the research, quote unquote, the research, right? But that can feel like an impossible task sometimes. So can you explain a little bit about the barriers that we have when it comes to access of the research?
Oh, yeah, there's so many. And I learned this firsthand. So even when I was in my doctoral program, my son, he was like 2, and he only had, maybe 1 or 2 words he could say reliably. And so I knew like red lights going off, red flags going up, like this was a problem. But here I am at Vanderbilt in a doc program with all the resources, and I still didn't know, where to turn for the research on late talkers. He ended up fine. He got early intervention, which we know is key. I can just imagine a teacher, and back when I was teaching, like how do we access research? So you asked about the barriers. There's so many. The first is, I think even just an awareness that there's tons of research coming out. There's these journals every day I'm seeing, something that I feel like is really relevant or interesting. And that stems from teacher training programs. And there was a great study done, I think like a year or 2 ago, showing that like we're not training teachers, with the right methods, and we're not doing it based on research. So just an awareness from your teaching program that there is research and that it can guide certain elements of your practice. Probably not everything. There's not research on everything, but for the big things, there are usually papers or meta-analyses that we can synthesize information from. So an awareness, then access. These journals cost so much. Which ones are the great ones that you should subscribe to? And let's say you do have access. You can private pay for the journal subscriptions. How do you have the time to read all of them? How do you synthesize the information? How do you understand the stats or the jargon? There's a lot of barriers. I think those are like the top 4 or 5 that I listed. And other fields, they've come up with solutions to deal with it. I think a lot of people have heard me talk about like the field of medicine. My sister's a doctor. Like they have products and corporations and even nonprofit like associations that synthesize and give that research to the practitioners, in that case, the doctors. We just don't have any of that. And I don't even think we have anything similar to that. Like I can't even think of an analogy for education that tries to even do that. It's very fragmented. There's a lot of one-off things like the reading research recap that I'm doing, trying to address that problem.
Yeah, totally. And when I think about research that even is open access, a lot of it is really difficult to digest. And, I consider myself a very literate person, well-read. And I opened up a research article and I was like, wow, this is really complicated. This is
Yeah.
really difficult to read. So maybe you can demystify some of the academic jargon that we hear about when we talk about research. Like, what are the different types of research studies that are even out there? And do they fall in different buckets, or would you categorize them in different ways?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer in like a few minutes here, but I'll try. Some people might be familiar with like this hierarchy or like a pyramid of research where you've got meta-analyses at the top, which synthesize individual research papers on a certain topic, and they aggregate those together. Then below that, or maybe some people will say equivalent to that, are randomized control trials, which is a type of experiment where someone's actually manipulating a variable, trying to control for all the other extra extraneous variables and just change one thing to see if an effect is due to that. And those are great for implementing or to guide classroom practice, I think. Those are the types of things you want. Randomized control trials, if you're going to make a large change. So this is why I say it's so hard to answer this question, because you'll see that pyramid, or you'll see people saying, well, it wasn't an RCT, it wasn't an experimental study, it didn't do this. But it depends what question you're asking. You match the design to the question of interest. And there's a lot of teacher questions that you don't need a randomized control trial for because they are super hard to run. You can think of all the things you might have to control for in the background that are almost impossible to control for, and so there's a lot of things that make that sort of gold standard very hard. But I would say there's brief experimental studies, even correlational studies are a great starting point for a hypothesis. And I can't talk about all of them here, but the take-home message, I think, for teachers is to be aware that there are many different designs. Depending on your question, you're going to want to look for research that matches that question, that uses an appropriate design for that. It's a lot like logic and like thinking through it, but you can get help, and researchers will help you with this. And now even I'm sure OpenAI, like ChatGPT, can help you think through this stuff. And a lot of people don't talk about like single case research design, which I think can be really helpful if you've got, one particular student who's struggling, to see what's worked with that specific person versus like a large randomized control trial study with a large group. So that was one thing I wanted to say. Another thing is you should think about using research, a large amount of research, or I would say a robust body of evidence, if you're going to make a big change. If you're going to make a large change in your classroom, like a new program or curricula, you need a large body of evidence. And especially if that's not easily reversible, if that decision is not something that you can test out quickly and change, right? Like a small tweak to how students enter the classroom or something. If you can't change that the next day, you better make sure there's a lot of evidence to support that. You have to weigh the other variables in terms of cost, training, resources. But if it's a small tweak you could change tomorrow, try that. If there might not be research, there might be only a correlational design, go ahead and try that. That's not going to be a big problem.
I love it. It's really helpful. And a lot of times when we're talking about the science of reading, there will be some people who will say, and I see this on social media all the time, everything that I do is grounded in the research or grounded in the evidence. And that might not necessarily be the case, because when you actually dig into the research, there might be a lot of research on the approach that you're using, but not necessarily every single activity that you're implementing in the classroom.
Yeah. Show me those posts, because I highly doubt there's anything that's entirely research-based. And I would argue that you don't need that. There's going to be some things that are just not, we don't need research to know like brushing your teeth every day is a good thing, right? There's some where the logic is just so strong that you don't need to run an expensive randomized control trial, right? We can still use professional like gut and intuition in certain cases. And that brings up a good point, like a related point about practices, like teacher practices versus programs. Now we kind of know with Sold a Story and stuff, we should have efficacy trials for programs and packaged curriculums. But what about those like million other little activities that teachers are doing? Like, how do you greet your students, or where are they sitting, or how crowded should your walls be? The environment. We are seeing more research on that too, but those are the things that you're not going to find exact studies on.
Yeah, there might not be a randomized controlled trial for like these 5 minutes of your day.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But when you think about these big program shifts, how you talked about, like if a school is implementing huge shifts, what type of research should we look at more? Meta-analyses would be the approach to go, or those randomized controlled trials? Is there like a one is better than the other for these bigger movements?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for those, if there's a big box or a program or a package that has a brand name and a company behind it, first thing you should do is email them and ask for their research. There's, in my opinion, no excuse in this day and age to not do that, especially if you're a larger company with a program. You should have your RCTs. You should have randomized control trials. Meta-analyses are not really appropriate in that instance, unless they had several randomized control trials on that specific and they were grouping it together. But even then, I think that individual randomized control trials, those experiments showing that it works, are going to be your best evidence. So you should email them. You should go to their website, see what studies are out there. You should be looking at the different clearinghouses too, like the What Works Clearinghouse, and never rely on just one because they all have their different cutoffs and what qualifies. So I always advise people, like, it should be green or meets qualifications across all of them. And just make sure that when you look at those randomized controlled trials, that they used a population that is similar to your own. So if they didn't do a large nationwide sample, make sure that like you read the population description and that you can see your students in this same study, because you want to make sure it was efficacious, effective for that same similar group of students.
I love that you said that. I heard Dr. Katie Pace Miles recently speak in New York City, and she was talking about when we look at the research, sometimes it's not like you're making this blanket statement about all kids. It's about in this particular study with these particular students under these particular measures,
yes,
this was the outcome. And I think we need to be smarter about interpretations. And
I love that. I love Katie. She's great. Yes. And I'm glad she said that. What works for whom and when, right? You want to make sure that, that it's all kind of met. And a lot of research is that there's a lot of caveats when you actually read a paper of like, oh, it was just this one measure, or, oh, it only improved this. So you do have to use your judgment when you're reading those papers or looking into studies.
Yeah, so it's not as black and white as people may think it is. And then you talked about correlational studies and experimental studies. What's the difference between those?
Yeah, great question. And so a correlation just implies an association. There's not necessarily a relationship. The great example that people give in the summertime, as ice cream intake increases, shark attacks also increase. But does eating ice cream cause shark attacks? No, there's an underlying variable, summer, right? Both these things, people are at beaches more in the summer. There's an increase in both. So like you could say those are correlated, but a correlation is like the first thing that you want to check. These variables should be moving together. What's a good one for education? Maybe sleep, number of hours of sleep, and reading scores, right? If we look at that for kids, because we know that's important. I'm trying to get my son to bed every night on time, right? Like it's a struggle. So let's say we know there's a correlation. We do a survey data on the number of hours slept and reading scores at the end of the year or something, and they move in tandem. That's what a correlation is. But does one cause the other? No, you can't say that yet because you haven't ruled out the million other things that could be causing that relationship. And in education, there are a ton of correlational studies. And it's not always easy. They don't say this is a correlational study, right? It's not always easy to figure that out from the abstract or the methods, especially if you don't know. And even for someone who's trained and like, I know which sort of methods are correlational, it's still confusing. And authors, sometimes scientists, they don't err on the side of being cautious. They kind of overstate their results at different places in the paper. So it's so important to have your own judgment when you're reading papers too, to be like, they probably shouldn't have said that. Peer review doesn't catch everything. And they're not going to tweak, certain sentences about like that. So my point is, Correlation's great. It's a very popular thing. Most studies in education are like that, but you do want to go to an experimental study where someone's manipulating a variable, and that's done through an experiment. And you usually have like 2 different groups, sometimes 3, and you try and control all these other variables either through randomization or statistical control, and you minimize the effects of anything else that could be causing it that you think could be causing it based on research, and then you see the outcome. And even that one study, though, you don't want to trust just one. Like, you want to be able to replicate it. Science is based on replication. So even just one experimental study is great, but you really want a bunch, especially for like a program. I would not rely on correlational evidence if you're implementing a large change.
That's helpful. And then experimental versus the randomized control trial, that's a little bit different as well.
Yeah. So there's a small distinction there. And sometimes, and people can use these interchangeably. A randomized controlled trial, and you could go on to add on the qualifiers like a double blind, meaning that the participants themselves don't know which group they're in, and the people observing don't know which group they're in. So there's no bias from like measurement effects, or there's all these scientific effects, all these things that could influence it. So that's like kind of like your gold standard of experimental studies. But there are brief experimental studies where they might randomize, or they might not, or they might match. So they'll find 2 students who are similar and then put one in the condition that they're like manipulating and the other one in the control group. So there's different ways to adjust for that. Like, perhaps they couldn't randomize. Sometimes, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but like, it's not ethical to randomize, or like there's a moral reason, so if you can't randomize, the next best thing is still to do an experimental study, but you didn't randomize to the different groups and then just manipulate the same variable. But this is years. I'm trying to condense it into like a few seconds here, and I'm sure I'm missing some key stuff, but this is why people do like PhDs and doctorates. Like, this is what you learn, and like that method's part about like how to think critically when you see a paper and what are the flaws.
Yeah, no, this is really great for me.
Or I would just say, like, all that to say, like, if you're interested in this, and there should be better courses. I'm making it seem like it's super hard, but it actually isn't. Like, if I can learn this, other people can too. Like, there should be some basic courses on this if you're getting credentialed, like how to understand research, some basic tenets. But that you asked a great question, though, about correlation and causation. You want causal evidence if you're implementing a large program.
Yeah, definitely. And then when something is peer reviewed, that is another stamp of approval.
Yeah, it is. But I would say scientists and researchers know that it's still a weak one. It's good. To me, if you're looking for evidence, you shouldn't even be reading anything that's not peer reviewed and in a good journal. That, to me, I don't weigh any of those sources heavily. And we're talking social media without citations, blog posts, white papers. Some white papers are better than others, but those are especially tricky. They can have the appearance of a research paper, but they're not. But for me, the minimum is a high quality journal, peer reviewed. And then there's like all these other checks and balances that happen in science, and peer review is like the minimum entrance point. Like, okay, now you're in the door. Now it gets critiqued by like other scientists. You have to replicate it. There's so many other things to make sure that what you found stays true over time, or doesn't, and something else replaces.
Yeah. So a lot of what educators might be reading when it comes to the research are other people's interpretation of the research. But if an educator maybe is dabbling into the papers, right, and they get themselves a journal and they're trying to read through and digest, how can they tell if the results are strong enough to trust? And are there certain things maybe in an article like sample size or effect size that we should be looking for to know that it's reliable or valuable for classroom change?
Yeah, it's a good question too. So again, if you're making a large change, you want a large sample size. There are those things that you should look for, like large sample size, a large effect size, very few outside, like they controlled for all the other variables. And again, it's like logic, it's thinking through. And I think that teachers would be really good at that part because they've been in a classroom and they can like read a paper and maybe look at the limitation section. All papers have a limitations because every study is limited in some way. There's never a perfect study. And so the researchers list those out. And as a teacher, you could be like, oh, well, why didn't they control for this? Why didn't they think of this thing that, all teachers know, but maybe someone who's been out of the classroom or a researcher who's never been in a classroom would never even think that that would influence the outcome. So I think that it's a lot of logic. The stats are hard, and yes, there's math involved, but at some point you just kind of have to trust that or go back and take courses in that. But a large effect size, a large sample size, and then strong logic, a logic model that makes sense to you as a teacher and measures. So what they're using as an outcome measure or to measure growth. Do you know that test? Do you like it? What are some flaws with it? Do you see kids in your class just like skipping through it? Is it a computerized test where they just aren't actually answering? That's going to give you some insight into that paper or whether you should trust it or not too.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I appreciate your tip of the hat to the logic aspect too, because oftentimes we hear, teaching, reading is a science, but it's also an art. And there's a lot that goes into the implementation piece. And two teachers can be following the same exact program and doing quote unquote the same things. And it may look differently in their classroom because of that implementation. Yeah. So what do we do when we come across different research studies that contradict each other?
No, I would say nothing. I mean, that's what researchers do is nothing. You just take it in, you absorb it. You know that, okay, now there's one study that says this, another that says this, and you just hold that knowledge and store it. A lot of research is like that. I rarely, if ever, see a paper that has direct classroom implications tomorrow. Unless you're doing really bad stuff in your classroom, right? Like you never knew about, explicit teaching of phonics or something, right? And you see a paper, then obviously you should change your practices tomorrow. But most of it is be aware, be alert, store this in the back of your mind. We'll wait till more research comes out or wait till, a follow-up commentary from the authors or something. But I mean, that's very common in research to see contradicting. It also goes back to this idea of make sure you read who the sample was, for whom and when, because one little thing could change that outcome. Maybe it's a different population. Maybe it was a different time of day. Maybe it was a different outcome measure. Most research is not the same study replicated exactly. And there's a million reasons for why that is, but there's no incentive mostly for researchers to do the exact same study. They want to publish novel or new findings. And so while there should be more replication, there isn't. But you just want to go back and look through and see maybe why. Again, that logic where it's not black and white, just figure out why they might have found a different result.
Yeah. And then are there any red flags that we should look for when it comes to research?
That's a great question. I think publish in a peer-reviewed journal. If you're looking at research, if that's your goal to look for evidence and look for things that might hold up over time, you have to follow the method that allows for that, which is publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's the minimum. So if it's just like a blog post or some books, sometimes educational books, you will say things and they look very credible and the authors have PhDs and, years in the classroom. But if there's no citation to an actual study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, to me, that's a red flag. That's probably the biggest one because I don't want to point out ones with individual studies because, again, that could just depend on those studies and that body of evidence could be evolving as it almost always is in education.
Yeah, we talked about this already, how you talked about the logic and implementation, and we have the art of teaching. You with your teaching background too, how can a teacher take some of this information and know that perhaps research isn't dictating every minute of my day, but I still want to find balance in aligning my instruction with the science of reading, staying true to the students in front of me?
I think that as long as you're making an effort to stay aware of new research, and I sincerely hope that better methods will become available in like the next 20 years, or that we'll have a more open system or more people synthesizing the research. But if you're open to that and your mind's open to change, you're open to what you're hearing, following up on a blog post, finding like the citation, but then also trusting your gut, you're in front of the classroom every day with these students. you know that student better than anyone, right? Like other than their parents, maybe, or and also sometimes more than their parents. I've had students who would open up to me that their parents were shocked when they came into parent teacher conferences. So it's hard to explain in like a few minutes, like which practices we know are evidence-based, things like explicit teaching of phonics, right? Those things we know. And I wish there was like a better place, the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides. Those are a great one. So maybe start for some evidence-based practices and programs for your classroom. And then it's just about tweaking it or tailoring it and then searching maybe for single case studies if you have a particular student who's challenging you in a way that like you might not know how to address, or like you just need some other maybe tactics or tips to work with them, and just seeing like if there's any research on that. And I wish there would be a better way to search those studies too, because there is such a large body of single case research that I know I would have found helpful as a special ed teacher working with some students who I just like could not, it was just not working. I was doing all the explicit systematic phonics instruction and like it just wasn't, I needed something else. So
yeah, that's definitely helpful. And I'm thinking too, the past couple of years, sound walls have become such a buzz. And everyone is like, you need a sound wall, you need a sound wall. But there's actually no research behind sound walls. And it's not to say that they're bad or they're faulty, but there isn't anything supporting it yet either. And I say yet because maybe there will be one day, but we can't say it's aligned to the science of reading necessarily.
It's a great example, right? Because we were talking earlier, like how busy should your classroom be, right? And do students actually need to know that, or is it helpful for teachers? And maybe it's just something they have and they don't need to put up, right? They just need to learn. There is research showing that kids need to see the mouth. They're getting phonics instruction. Like that's very helpful. But yeah, do they need to know all the stuff? You're right. Like I don't think there is research on that. I haven't stayed up to date on that particular one, but I agree with you. I think that there's no research showing that that is beneficial for students.
Yeah, we have to tap into those articulatory gestures like you mentioned, but I don't know, maybe 10 years from now there will be.
And maybe only though for a subset of students, right? Yeah. And that takes a while to figure out too, right? Because this is one flaw with group design studies. You're averaging all these kids that might have very different backgrounds into one number to get the result in a group experimental design study. And so a perfect example might be several single case studies in that case of seeing who maybe it might work for and who not. So I think that's important to distinguish too. And that takes even longer, I feel like, to suss out exactly who the effect is working for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it just goes to show how nuanced the research realm really is. And going back to your subset of students, and for these particular students, like they need it. And for these particular students, it might not move the needle much at all. But to be a wise consumer of that was really great. In the beginning, we mentioned your reading research recap. Can you share a bit about your mission with that?
Yeah, of course. So it's actually going on its 5th year. I started it back when I had my company Elemento just on a whim. It wasn't like the core product. I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about Substack. And Substack back then was a platform that made it really easy to set up a blog. And I was thinking, okay, what blog would I do if I could set up one? And I thought about research. I was like, well, I would just take the research that came out that week. Back then it was weekly. Now it's monthly. And I would just summarize the new research that came out. And I think I mentioned it in one Facebook group, the big one, the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Known in College. And then within hours, there were hundreds of signups. It's like, whoa, there's interest in it. And I think it's just the right timing too. This was like right around when Sold a Story came out and people just wanted to know. So it grew to about, 4,000 or 5,000 subscribers. And then when I joined Metametrics, it was paid back then, because I had to supplement the product growth I was doing at Elemento. But when Elemento was acquired, Metametrics made the monthly recap free. So it became monthly and it's free. And there's a YouTube video channel now, so you can read it and you can get a summary of the article and links to all the new research that came out the past month. Or you could just watch the summary that I do now. And I have ideas to even go bigger. So maybe by the time this airs, I think you said mid or late fall, there will be some new tweaks to the recap, because like I said, there's not a good system out there for teachers. So if I can amplify that, that would be great. So we'll see.
I'd be so excited about that. I tune in every month.
Okay. I'm glad you like it.
It's really great. And is there maybe a piece of recent literacy research that came out that you found especially interesting?
Ooh, there was a great review that's been circulating on running records. Have you seen that one?
No.
Oh, it's great. I'll send it to you. And I think the authors, I think it's out of a team in Australia, did a really good job talking about the historical perspective about why running records were new and novel and how they gained traction, but then also did a really good job showing where they're flawed and how they're not valid, reliable assessments, especially given that we have valid, reliable oral reading fluency assessments now that take less time. So I thought it was a very nuanced, a good sort of review piece. There's so much great research coming out, though. The one that I'm thinking about for the next reading research recap, this will have already come out, though, by the time this is aired, but it was super cool. It's about using students' names in a story and how that leads to better reading comprehension outcomes. So that might be a way to get kids more engaged, especially in the younger grades. You probably can't do that for every story, but with AI stuff right now, you could probably tweak it so that they're the protagonist and they feel like they're the ones doing the actions in the stories. So I thought that was cool.
I love that there's research on that.
I thought it was super cool too. I didn't know that. So
yeah. And the running record conversation is interesting as well. I actually was just talking to someone on Instagram about that recently.
Oh, yeah.
Because somebody had posted about not wasting your time doing running records in the beginning of the school year when you can be utilizing more reliable measures. I had commented on it and somebody else had commented, but running records don't necessarily have to be for a level, and they've have been misinterpreted for years. And I was like, I also agree with that stance as well, because I do think there's value in sitting down and listening to a child read and noting their behaviors and things of that nature. But the way that they've been used for so many years in the terms of the leveling system and MSV.
You hit the nail on the head. That's what the article goes into well. So I'm glad you brought that up, because exactly that. They have a wonderful quote in it about there's so much value in sitting down, listening, observing. They list like 10 different things, but they end it, their sentence at the end of that paragraph is, but you don't need a running record to do that. The running record should not be, like you said, the way to put them in a text level. It's more just to hear where they're at reading. But if you want a screener, then you should be using what we know are valid, reliable screeners. This is for a different reason you would listen to them reading out loud.
Oh, I love that. Now I really have to
dig
into there. So I've heard you speak before about wanting to dismantle this, you call it this artificial wall between research and practice. So what do you think are some of the system level shifts that you think we need to make to bridge this gap? And who knows how long that'll take, but
yeah, there are so many systems would have to change. The publishing, peer review publishing is a mess. There's new models coming out, but they're too complicated and I don't quite understand them all fully to talk about them here. But teacher training systems have to change. I would even say school and district level, there has to be time built in and a culture of let's get together, read this study or review this. That has to be built in to the teacher's day, and they have to be compensated for that time. Continuing education also would have to change. Like, how do we keep them up to date? So there's just so many. It seems daunting to think about. Those three right there would have to talk to each other, and there would have to be a way. But a lot of people don't like the idea of the medicalization of education, right? This medical model. But I do like it in this respect of how they get the research out to physicians, right? The practitioners. I don't like that model, the medical model, when you're talking about like an individual student in a classroom. That's different. So I just want to be clear about that. But I do like how there is a system in place for doctors to stay up to date on the research and to get the training they need before they become a doctor. So those two things I think would have to change. So
yeah,
I don't know how to do that, but
yeah. I know, put it in the universe.
Right, yeah.
But it's so true. And for anyone who has listened to Solda's story, it's like, well, that's part of the problem. Teachers were not kept up to date with the research that was out there, that has been out there for decades and decades. And if we had a different narrative, we'd be in a different place right now too.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it was Sold a Story that was talking about the teachers often getting research or getting their PD from marketing or sales teams that come in, but they're selling you a product. It's such a clear conflict of interest, right? And so there just has to be a better way.
Yeah, definitely. Let's end the conversation with a little nod of inspiration. In just a sentence or two, what's your hope for the future of research in education?
I think just going off of what we just said, I would love to see those large systems working together to provide a better way. It's going to look different than it does in the medical field. I don't see how that can work for teachers. Maybe it can, but I hope that there's just a better association or corporation. It could be for profit, not for profit. I just hope there's a better way out there for teachers to access their research in the next 5 to 10 years. Because now, whereas in the past, I do see teachers wanting it. There's an interest. 10 years ago, like when I started my doctoral program, I think it would have been crazy to talk about a blog about new research for teachers. I think for researchers, sure, like as a doc student, but teachers now are really interested in it. And so my wish, my goal, my hope in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe longer, because these things take time, is just a better system for disseminating the research to teachers.
Well, we're all going to be crossing fingers and toes because we know our educators, they need it. We all need it to make sure that it's accessible so we could do this good work. This has been such a delight, Neena. I love chatting with you today. Where can my listeners connect with you further?
So the Reading Research Recap is a great place. There's a YouTube channel, and if you just type in Reading Research Recap, you'll find that. They can subscribe there. And I'm on LinkedIn. They can always just connect with me and send me a message. It's probably the thing that I check the most. So in terms of like social media stuff.
Well, thank you again so much. This has been so wonderful. And we appreciate that smart brain of yours to dismantle all of the scary things when it comes to research so we can feel more confident in tackling some of this big academic jargon. So thanks again.
Of course. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.